I would like to further extend the welcome that Bob shared with you on this Juneteenth. Today, we celebrate the freedom of those African American men and women in Texas who, on this date in 1865, finally learned that they had been legally freed 2.5 years earlier by the Emancipation Proclamation. We grieve for those years lost in their lives, and we remember that changing laws does not automatically change hearts. I am Pastor Susie Hutchison, and I am glad that you are here joining us today, whether you are in the pews or online, whether you're here on Sunday or some other day of the week. We are grateful that you are joining us. Today, we are in a series called Jesus Apprentice, Doing What Jesus Did. We are looking at Jesus' life so that we can examine our own lives and bring them better into alignment with Jesus' way. As Christians, we believe that Jesus is the revelation of God, God incarnate or in the flesh. We believe that the testimony of Jesus' life is our best understanding of God and God's will for the earth. We believe that Jesus' life reveals the saving grace that God offers us and that Jesus is the way. And if we want to grow closer to God, there are a lifetime of things that we can learn by following Jesus. Last week, Pastor Bob talked about proclaiming the kingdom of God. Jesus did it, and we get to do it too. This week, we'll be looking at Jesus' healing ministry. If you have read any of the Gospels, you may have noticed this. Jesus never walks into Galilee and finds a healthy child and makes them sick. Not once did Jesus paralyze anybody or even take away their sight. You see, God does not wield illness or injury or pain. God wields healing, brings wellness, vision, and freedom to people who are marginalized by the religious authorities. That is Jesus' work. In the last couple of years, we've all had crash courses on epidemiology, public health, and virology. We've learned about aerosol versus droplet transmission. We've learned about actuarial tables that predict death rates among certain populations of people. We've learned about compliance rates for safeguards. We've learned about spike proteins. And we've learned about the costs of isolation and quarantine. Though the rates of suicide completion went down during COVID, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention says that depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts were more prevalent, particularly for youth, young adults, caregivers, frontline workers, and Black, Indigenous, and people of color populations. Being isolated from community is hard. For some folks, it's tragic, even deadly. And in biblical times, community exclusion was a common response to illness. They knew nothing about viruses or bacterium or genetics. They mostly blamed illness on sin. So banishment from the community was not a safeguard for the health of the community, well, unless they believed that sin was contagious. But perhaps this exclusion was done to punish the afflicted for their sin. Maybe it was just a desire not to have to see the suffering of other people. Or perhaps it was done to protect God from the sight of sinners. After all, we know that these exclusionary rules were backed up by the Jewish law, which forbade entry into the temple for lots of folks with lots of conditions. The book of Leviticus has an extensive list of reasons that a person can be deemed unfit to enter the temple. And in a world where God resides at the temple, well, it means a lot of folks are deemed unworthy of coming into the presence of God. So let's discover was some of what could prevent a person from being able to approach God. It is written in Leviticus 21, 16 through 18. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, none of your future descendants who have some kind of imperfection are allowed to offer their gods food. No one who has an imperfection will be allowed to make an offering. This includes anyone who is blind, crippled, disfigured, or deformed." Now you see, Aaron's descendants were to be the priests of the temple. And the priests were the ones who could approach God on behalf of the people. So here we have this testament that people who are blind or otherwise impaired or disfigured cannot approach God. Pretty clear, pretty simple. Does it not sound that way? But friends, Jesus, God incarnate, God in the flesh, has a way of messing with our pretty easy, pretty simple. As Christians, we know what Jesus says in Matthew 5:17 about his relationship with and to the law. Don't even begin to think that I have come to do away with the law and the prophets. I haven't come to do away with them, but to fulfill them. You see, Jesus came to shed light on, to demonstrate, or to fulfill the law and the prophets. He came to show the God-given meaning of these laws and prophecy. So today we're going to look at what the law said about the sick, what Jesus did for the sick, and what we are called to do for the sick. So what does Jesus tell us about the blind who are forbidden from the priesthood? John 9, 1 through 7 says, "As Jesus walked along, he saw a man who was blind from birth. Jesus' disciples asked, 'Rabbi, who sinned so that he was born blind, this man or his parents?' Jesus answered, 'Neither he nor his parents. This happened so that God's mighty work might be displayed in him. While it's daytime, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world.' After he said this, he spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and smeared the man's eyes. Jesus said to him, 'Go, wash in the pool of Siloam.' This word means sent. So the man went away and washed. When he returned, he could see." Those who rule the temple say the blind may not draw near to God. But Jesus, God in the flesh, touches the blind man. For Jesus, the man's humanity trumps his blindness. At the intersection of the waters of the divine mouth and the dirt of God's creation, all that prevents the man from entering that faith community is erased. Jesus heals the man, declaring him worthy of even the esteem of the priesthood. But Jesus doesn't stop there, because there are lots and lots of folks outside the walls of the temple who need to know that God loves them. In biblical times, ancient Hebrews upheld laws of niddah, in which menstruating women went into seclusion and had to be separated from the rest of society until they had experienced 7 clean days following their flow. And the keepers of the temple law upheld that by preventing women from participating in temple life for the whole duration of their seclusion, no matter how long it may be. It says in Leviticus 15:25b, "The duration of her unclean discharge will be like the period of her menstruation. She will be unclean." Sounds clear and simple, right? But we know what Jesus does with clear and simple. And what does Jesus, the incarnation of God, the fulfillment of the law, show us? Let's go to Luke 8:42b through 48. As Jesus moved forward, he he faced smothering crowds. A woman was there who had been bleeding for 12 years. She had spent her entire livelihood on doctors, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the hem of his clothes, and at once her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When everyone denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds are surrounding you and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." When the woman saw that she couldn't escape notice, she came trembling and she fell before Jesus. And in front of everyone, she explained why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. "Daughter, your faith has healed you," Jesus said. "Go in peace." You see, Jesus didn't come with some sort of force field around himself that prevents the unclean from approaching him. He has not set his disciples to guard his God self from the touch of the unclean. Jesus allows himself to be available to this woman. He sees her humanity. He does not ostracize her. Jesus heals her. Or maybe even in a more interesting take, he tells her that her faith, strong enough to cross those societal boundaries and norms, that's what heals her. Sometimes I wonder, did she also have the courage to show up at temple on the next Sabbath? Would she be bold enough to present herself to those who had rejected her for 12 long years? I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that Jesus knocked down the barrier that the temple had constructed. Now, I could probably go on giving you these kinds of examples all day. But I expect you'd fall asleep, so I won't. But I would like to give you one more. It's Leviticus 13, 1 through 3. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When a person has a swelling, a scab, or a shiny spot on their skin, and it becomes an infection of skin disease on their skin, they will be brought to the priest, either to Aaron or one of his sons. The priest will examine the infection on the skin. If the hair in the infected area has turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin, then it is an infection of the skin disease. Once the priest sees this, he will declare the person unclean." Now, you see, in Jesus' day, skin diseases were a big deal. You've probably read translations where skin disease is translated as leprosy. But there were lots and lots of skin diseases that made people unclean to the community. And of course, there are plenty of times when Jesus encounters someone with a skin disease. But for the purpose of today's discussion, let's look at Matthew 8, 1 through 4. Now, when Jesus had come down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. A man with a skin disease came, kneeled before him, and said, "Lord, if you want, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched him, saying, "I do want to. Become clean." Instantly, his skin disease was cleansed. Jesus said to him, "Don't say anything to anyone. Instead, go and show yourself to the priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded. This will be a testimony to them." Once again, Jesus touches the man and takes away the barrier that the temple law has set between the man and God. But my favorite part of this story is that he sends the man to show the priest, the very person who has already declared him unclean, unworthy of being in the presence of God. Jesus wants that temple priest to know that no one is beyond the reach of God. I like to imagine this man walking into the temple through the crowd of people who had ostracized him, right up to the priest, and hearing from the mouthpiece of the temple that had banished him, "You are clean. Welcome." Imagine how empowering that would be. Imagine how he feels when he offers the gift that Moses commanded, when he makes that first sacrifice, this ritual that had been withheld from him for so long. Imagine what everybody who witnesses that will believe about God's willingness to be with people, clean and unclean. It's quite a testimony. Jesus sees people's humanity. Jesus knows that a person's identity is the image of God that is within them. It's not the blindness, not the bleeding, not the skin disease, the image of God. And Jesus uses his power to heal the sick and to heal the community that believes that anything in the world can possibly trump the image of God in people. So, if you are a Jesus apprentice, you are in the business of healing too. Healing is not merely curing, don't get me wrong. Curing addresses the disease. It is the work of doctors and medical professionals and amazing bodies that can heal. Healing, on the other hand, addresses the whole person. It is a restoration of the God image. It is a making of a place at the table for all those whom God has touched. So, how do we, as Christ followers, become healers? First, we have faith. Faith that Jesus wants healing for all people, just as he told the man with the skin disease. And a deep faith that Jesus did, does, and will enter into brokenness and restore us. Second, to be a healer, we need to have the boldness of that hemorrhaging woman to reach out to God, even though the world may have declared us unworthy. We have the audacity of Jesus to be present with people and to disassemble barriers that have been erected between the sacred and the human. And third, when we see a person suffering, like that blind man, we have to be prepared to get our hands a little dirty. We have to dip ourselves into that space where the sacred and the human meet. Healing can be very messy. And lastly, like Jesus declaring that her faith is what healed that bleeding woman, we need to be ready to proclaim the power of faith found in the hearts of those outside the church and on the streets. We need to bear witness and even to celebrate the testimony of all people whom God has touched. Jesus does not limit his healing to those who are welcomed. Some of God's best work is done in the streets, in the villages, and any place that there is pain. God is among the people who are hurting. And that's where we, as his apprentices, should be. Amen.